Deborah has always known she was part of something bigger: the Southwest, academia, Native American tribes, and her family in general.
I was born in Yuma, Arizona. And I think when I was a child, we don't see ourselves as a culture or an ethnicity. You see yourself as a member of a family. So I was a sister. That's how I felt. I was a middle child with sisters, and we had very many, many cousins. My mother is one of 15 kids, most of whom all lived in Yuma and had children of their own. And my father is one of 10 children who all lived in Yuma and had children of their own. We could not go to the grocery store without running into an aunt or an uncle or an extended family member.
Welcome to In This Family, presented by Nexus Family Healing. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, President and CEO. Some people naturally feel curious about their culture and family history, but for author and educator Deborah Jackson Taffa, it was a yearning, a longing, and perhaps even a personal calling to know who she was. She wanted to know where she came from and to understand how her family was embedded in a societal macrocosm and a forcibly changing world. Leaning on the power of her culture, her discovery of where and how she fits in has been something of a journey. Deborah's mom was Latina. Her dad is Native American. Deborah is a citizen of the Quatsan Yuma Nation in Winter Haven, California, and Laguna Pueblo, just west of Albuquerque. Deborah's memoir, Whiskey Tender, was a National Book Award finalist and named one of 2024's top 10 books in any category by The Atlantic, Audible, and Time magazine. It's a very moving account of her efforts to figure out her identity through her Latina and Native heritage and a sometimes difficult relationship with her mother. Deborah's family started out in California and moved to Farmington, New Mexico. Her attempts to integrate the world of her heritage and societal expectations to shed her cultural relevance led to big experiences and big feelings.
In California, in the Yuma area, I was young. I was so young that I identified via my family because we had so many relatives. That was who we really saw. And if we went to, for example, church, we went on the reservation and everybody looked kind of similar. When we moved to Farmington, I was 6, 7 years old. That was when I met people from Texas. And the really shocking thing was that I met a lot of Navajo or Dene people who are, amongst themselves. There are young Navajo boys, for example, that I like who they can only date Navajo girls from a certain clan. They can't date outside the wrong clans, even within their same tribe. And so when those kids looked at me as half Latina and half Native from two different tribes, I was essentially like to them not Native. So I had this very odd situation when I got to Farmington where I didn't fit in with the kids who had come from Texas for their parents to work in the oil fields. I didn't fit in. There was a large contingent of Mormons from Utah because we were right in the Four Corners. And then there were a lot of Dene Navajo kids. And then there were a lot of Hispanic kids from northern New Mexico, which were kind of my mother's people. But because I was a half-breed, I was always in this liminal state of kind of not knowing where I fit. But in terms of knowing I was different, my sisters liked to eat hot dogs, and in high school they wanted to go to Mexico on spring break, and I was the one who was the vegetarian and kind of this hippie who wanted to wear my hiking boots and go out hiking in the land. I think that was something that was emerged in me very young via my relationship with my grandma Esther, who is a very old world traditional Native woman from Laguna Pueblo, which is Deb Howland's tribe and Leslie Marmon Silko's tribe. We all live in that same little village. And that was where she was from. And she was a very gentle soul, and she died when I was really young. But she was kind of my maternal figure because I had a problematic relationship with my mother. And I think that she really impacted me, even though the memory of her was always kind of vague. because my mother and I failed to bond. I was the one child that she didn't nurse, and I was given a bottle so often to the extent that I had baby bottle tooth decay, which also kind of created this layer of separation between me and other people. And I think it wounded me very deeply, because as a little kid, I would see that people would look at me and I knew that something was kind of wrong. And I didn't have those front baby teeth removed until I was maybe 4 or 5. So writing the earliest chapters of the book that deal in my earliest childhood were the most difficult parts of the book to write, because they're still frame photos. You're trying to make them move. And then there was this intense mother wound that had situated itself there. And I couldn't figure out how to forgive my mother for a very long time. And I don't know that you can write a memoir until you have the grace to either forgive people for what they've done to you, or you forgive yourself, and your anger then is a little muted and a little more reasonable and objective in your telling.
I would love to ask more about your relationship with your mother. Can you say more about the failure to bond?
Yeah, I think I've reflected on it so often, and I think a portion of it is that my father always wanted to have a boy, and my mother had 2 girls, and then she had a boy, and he died within 24 hours of when he was born. And she was extremely wounded by that death. I think, for a long time I kind of dismissed it. I don't think I fully understood until I became a mother what it would feel like to carry a baby to full term, and to hold them and to see them and to think that they were fine and that they really weren't. And so she tried again right away. And my brother was born in April and I was born in May of the next year, so 13 months. And when I was born and I was a girl, and then she had another girl, and then she had another girl, I think that that might have, I can only create suppositions. Also, we're just very different people. My mother was a very conservative Catholic who believed very much in the rite of reconciliation, of penance. If you missed Mass on Sunday, it was a mortal sin. You had to not eat anything but fish during Lent. She was extremely conservative. And I was always a wild little girl. You can't be an artist without having a wild spirit. And I think she just recognized me and right in me right away that I would be hard to manage, and that I didn't bow very much to what she tried to tell me. I was hyper intelligent from when I was fairly young. I read before I started kindergarten. And then when I got older, it just got worse and worse. I think one of the things that I disliked about my mother's family is there are a lot of Hispanic people from northern New Mexico who have mixed bloodlines. So there are indigenous bloodlines mixed in with many, many people in northern New Mexico. But her family always insisted that they were puro sangue Spanish, that it was like they had come directly from Spain without stopping up off in Mexico and intermingling for 300 years. And I think that a lot of my siblings just kind of shrugged and took that as a fact. But it really wounded me for my father. I was very, very close with my dad. And my grandma, again, his mother, was a big part of my life and my childhood. And I felt like he had been wounded enough by society in his upbringing pre-Jim Crow. I hated to see him wounded by the people who were supposed to love him the most. And she knew that, and I knew that. And we argued about it sometimes when I was a teenager. And then towards the end of her life, we just kind of let it sit quietly. And we could see each other, and she loved my children, and we were kind. But when she died, it was a very difficult time for me, because I think it was the first time I realized we would never have resolution. It was never going to happen. It was impossible then, because she was beyond the veil, and it broke my heart. I think somewhere deep inside I kept thinking, someday we will understand each other. And I remember standing at her deathbed, and it never happened. I felt even that distance when I tried to hold her hand before she died. It was just, I couldn't bridge it. It feels like one of the biggest tragedies of my life, because I see other people who have close relationships with their mothers, and it's a sad thing not to have that.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. And it sounds like that really has been a large part of your experience with that. And was that different or the same for your siblings?
I think my oldest sister had a similar experience, but some of my other sisters didn't experience it as much. My mother was very kind to them, and when she was disappointed with you as a parent, there was a coldness that she could enact, and it was very hurtful when you were young to be told, oh, well, you're not allowed to come with us. I'm going with your sister to shop and we're going to the mall and, we don't want you to come. It was a very verbally kind of apparent. She didn't hide it. She would just say it. And so it took me many years. For a long time, I told myself, well, I'm the unfortunate one because some of my siblings got along with her. And then at a certain point, I thought, I think I'm the lucky one. Because
Say more about that.
Yeah, I just think that some of my siblings, they were so close to my mother and she cared for them so deeply and she did so much for them that they never really learned how to leave and launch. They were never pushed out aggressively of the nest and made to fly on their own. And so they took a long time to kind of figure out, my brother now lives with my father and cares for him. And, he's never really kind of had that life where he's just been out in the world. And I think in some ways her love for him was so intense that it created a responsibility on his part that he could never escape. And in a lot of ways, I'm happy that I was able to gain distance because sometimes that's all you can do with your parents is create a boundary and move on from that with love in your heart, with an attempt to understand, but with the knowledge that maybe you won't be able to. That's where I landed.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to hear. And I'm sure that there will be a lot of people who can relate to that because we all do have to come to terms with those relationships with our parents at some point. When you were describing like your mother's family and then the hurt that you would feel for your dad at times of and your own exclusion. I'm sensing the word exclusion. But there also seems to be this what like almost an identity shame that was happening for your mother. Is that true? Would there be some of that? Would that have been part of the dynamic?
I think that it's been baked into our school curriculum and to our society that, there is this notion of Native people not having had a culture prior to colonization. And there was a flattening of many, many diverse cultures with this world Indian, which is a misnomer because it's, based on India. And this idea that if we were not using the land, then it meant that there was no one really who owned it and it could be taken. So it was sort of a propaganda effort, I think, to not recognize the many beautiful aspects of our philosophies and our belief systems. And so, you go to school and I never knew that people in my area of the country had genetically modified a grass and a flower to create corn, or that Chaco Canyon and Chichen Itza and, all the way down into Peru, that there were these incredible cities that had existed and that it was really the smallpox and diseases that were brought that decimated a lot of people. And it wasn't all weaponry and it wasn't all war. It was sometimes just disease because we didn't have domesticated animals. And, I didn't know that we knew of the concept of zero or that people in the Americas had a 2,000 calorie diet when people in Europe were starving, or that we had a concept of childhood and that kids weren't forced into child labor, but that we had this idea of kids being fragile until they were 6 and they had to be treated gently and allowed an imagination. There were so many nice things about our culture, but in school, the only thing they really present is this sort of juncture of failure that is the wars and the genocide. And then you read about that in class and it makes you feel so bad about who you are, And then I know one thing that really wounded me was that as a child, I learned that the planet has a spirit and that it's alive and that the trees are alive and that the animals are alive. And, You know, when you get to high school and you understand that a lot of psychologists talked about that historically as that primitive identity, meaning that if you identify with objects, you know, you basically, and the earth is an object and the rocks and the trees are objects, that you have a childlike mentality, that you're somehow inferior. And that was just a part of myself that I couldn't give up. I could never give up. And it was so devastating to think, oh, but only if they had listened to my ancestors and believed even a little bit, or even considered even a little bit their philosophies, maybe we wouldn't have all these problems with climate change right now. So there's like nostalgia, regret, longing for what the world might have been like if you had been admired. And then underneath all of it is shame that, you know, people see us as inferior, as childlike, as less than intellectual. And, you know, growing up, I wanted to grow up and be an author and go to school and be a professor and do lots of things. And it makes you feel like, well, should I be loyal to what I actually believe and face down the criticism and the condescending attitudes? And how do I do that alone? And I need community. And who's my community? Where's my community? It was lonely. It was a lot of different things. It was a very difficult childhood in terms of what I had to stand up against, I feel like.
Yeah, and you use the term at some point, and I'm sure in many places, you know, living in two worlds. And while that seems like a simple phrase, it's very complex. And it seems like even when I listened to what you were talking about with your dad, it seemed like your dad was making decisions to be very future forward for your family, you know, and
Yep.
but that you were longing for your history too, and that
Yeah.
you know the roots that you have, and that part of your identity. And it is like living in two worlds. So how was that for you, growing up, and even now, because you seem to be able to live in both worlds.
I think I would clarify that it's like two philosophical worlds. You know, the world is one, and we're becoming less, we have fewer and fewer boundaries. Like, we travel internationally and we're very engaged in the world as Native people, but we live kind of sandwiched between two belief systems for sure. And it requires code switching quite a bit, is what I have found. And I think a long time ago when people talked about code switching, it was like about passing or about, you know, all of these negative terms. But I think of it as being multilingual. Like when I'm on a campus at a university, I know how to behave in a professional way. When I'm with my aunties on the reservation, I might actually speak in slightly different ways and be more relaxed because it's a language that they appreciate and they know better than the one that I use on campus. I had some reviewer or some podcast host one time who told me, well, this book is about you teaching young people how to reclaim and resist assimilation. And I felt really sad because I was like, well, no, not really. I think what it attempts to do is to demonstrate how I created a balance between assimilating and resisting in a way that worked for me. And I want to clarify what I mean by that. I mean that as a young Indigenous kid, a lot of times you feel like, I want to save my family. My grandfather's an alcoholic. My father was always poor. I'm going to be the one who's going to go out. I'm going to be a social justice warrior. I'm going to figure everything. There's this incredible burden that children place on their shoulders. And I know what I have told my children is, I'm thrilled if you want to go work in environmental law and fight for the health of the earth. But if you're like my son, who's a computer scientist, and just wants to have a simple, joyful life in Tucson, Arizona with his girlfriend, I'm like, that is enough, because you were never expected to be happy coming out of this family lineage. And I want you to think of joy, just simple, mere joy, as resistance enough. And beyond that, your value system is your responsibility to create. How are you going to create a life that does resist to some extent the greed of capitalism or the ugliness of destroying the planet? Those are the values that I have, you know. But you need to, I can't create for you assemble a box of value systems, you're responsible for assembling your own. And I had to assemble mine, and my dad had to assemble his. And so it's really, I feel like the book is really about the complexity of assembling an identity for a Native American kid who is sandwiched between these opposing value systems. One that says, go out, fight, climb the, social ladder, get a career, be incredibly empowered, have money. And the other that says, how are you taking care of your old aunties? Did you go back for feast days? Did you bring flour and potatoes and meat and go out and pray in the plaza and think about your ancestors while you were there? They're very different value systems, clearly. And that's where I think the pressure begins. Almost all Native people have a spiritual crisis at some point in the development of their identity, because they're trying to balance these two very opposing worlds.
In managing two different philosophical worlds, I have to imagine that you brush up against mental health issues and or trauma, even if it's purely related to like experiences of marginalization, oppression, or racism. Can you talk about how mental health and or trauma relates to your experience?
I think people need a foothold in some sort of, children need to learn how to die to their childhood, to be born to their adulthood. And it's like, it's a natural thing. But for me, it went all the way to, like a suicidal experience that landed me in the hospital for a week when I was in high school. Yeah. And so it was, the depression became very severe as I understood this sort of divisiveness in my family between my mother's worldview and my father's, the pressure that they put on me to be a model citizen, that pressure that I talked about before, that Indigenous kids often feel like I'm the one who has to save my family. When I say I'm first gen, I mean that I'm a first generation high school graduate. Neither of my parents finished high school. And so there was a lot of pressure, and then the outside pressure. So you have family pressure at home, you have academic pressure, and then the societal pressure of having grown up in a little town that national newspapers had dubbed the Selma, Alabama of the Southwest in the 1970s when I was growing up there. It was just the very first Matthew Shepard hate crime. People that were sentenced under that law came from Farmington, New Mexico. It's a really stressful little city. And so it was very difficult. Like I do think, having meditated on it now for a long time, clearly, I do think that all children are looking for a way to, you die to your childhood and you are birthed through an adult. And that's what a rite of passage used to be. And in tribes a long time ago, they were very meaningful. Like you would run to the east on one morning at sunrise, and then you would run to the south, and there would be stories and there would be myths, and it was a way of helping girls become women, for example. And I had just started to look around and really notice that for me, a rites of passage was like going to prom. And, you saw what that was like in Pretty in Pink. The television show in the 80s were like very misogynistic and patriarchal and just very ugly. And then it was like getting your driver's license, and there was such an emptiness to it. And, for me, it became very stark because we would go back to the reservation and I would see the ceremonial things that happened there were so beautiful and so ancient and had so much depth. And I could not figure out how to wed those two worlds together and kind of figure out, like, how can I make this serve me? It just didn't. And then you add all of the alcoholism that is very predominant in Native cultures. And my understanding of that as I've gotten older is that there's sort of this passion and fire to resistance that emerges kind of alongside other people who have sort of a fatalistic, I'm just not going to try. There's a lot of diabetes on the reservation, and people that are not healthy. And so there's like this kind of low energy response that is depressive and sad about what has been done and wrought in society against us with governmental policies and oppressive histories. And then there is on the other side, like this fiery rebellion that ultimately hurts the individual. It doesn't really hurt society. It's a really outward appearance of objecting and of fighting, but it's not organized or thought out in that it just ends up having someone die in a car accident or be hospitalized. But between the two, the thing that I had started to revere as a young girl was the wild one, this idea of an energetic response to the the oppression. But I've never been able to drink alcohol. And so I think I was in high school and I was friends with a girl who was also kind of a misfit in my hometown. Her father was Korean and her mother was English, and she had gone to Juilliard. She was a singer. She was our choir teacher in junior high. And the two of us paired up, and she started to bring alcohol around. And I drank with her and smoked weed with her for a couple of months my junior year. And wow, my mood descended very rapidly. Like I got very, very dark in a very short period of time, maybe 2 or 3 months. And then it was kind of the perfect storm because I was in a class called American Humanities that wed history with literature, and it was an advanced placement course. It was wonderful. I actually liked it. But one day in that period of time, one of the teachers came in and gave us a book written by D. Brown called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And it basically marches across the United States and tells of the worst Indian wars and the worst murders of Indigenous women and children by the cavalry and all. Like, it's just an incredibly dark book. And I read it, and my response to it was, oddly enough, it was like I couldn't speak. I became very mute. Like, I was just like very quiet. I tried to talk to one of my sisters, and I couldn't talk to my mother, and my father was working so much. And I think my parents had always defaulted to, you're not a victim. We're not victims. You have to give 110%. You cannot be weak. Because you're Native, you have to try harder than everyone else. It was like they didn't want to ever play that role. And so it was hard to complain or to cry or to say, I feel sad, and I didn't know what to do. And my sister found me, and I was sent to the hospital, and they kept me for about a week. And the oddest thing about it was like removing the pressure from a pressure cooker. Suddenly my mom and dad were like, what is happening? And everything broke open. I think I broke open the topic for everyone in the family. Suddenly we had a lot of conversations, and that my father's health insurance wouldn't pay for me to have therapy. But I started to go out by myself in the early mornings to walk in the Canyonlands. It kind of looks like Moab around Farmington. It's very pretty. I would go out and walk and walk and walk and walk. And ever since then, I've been a runner and a hiker and a skier, and I'm always outside. It's my mental health space. I walk probably 4 to 5 miles or jog 4 to 5 miles a day in Santa Fe. And, and then I ended up I did have therapy, traditional therapy via medicine people when I was 19 in my early 20s. So I sat with Cheyenne medicine men, Navajo medicine men, different medicine men who brought me through ceremonies and did things for me. And I experienced a lot of growth after that. It was like it ended up ultimately being something good that had happened to me, though I would not advise any child, you know what I mean? I think learning who you can talk to and being able to admit your frailty, your fear, your depression is so important. And I just could not open my mouth to find my voice. It was devastating. And ever since then, I've been very cautious about alcohol because it just worked as such a depressive in my body. It was so bad for me.
I want to talk about your parents a little more so that we can really get a picture of them. You talked about being marginalized in grade school, being treated differently because your mom was Latina and your dad was Native American. Did you ever talk to them about what you were going through?
Like I was saying when I was young, I think my father was always like, you can't be weak. He came from a family with a lot of brothers. He was the fifth child in his family, with 7 boys and 3 girls, and they were just very like, a lot of times if I expressed concern, he would, he was very matter of fact about it. But my mother one time did go and confront a nun that had created problems for me, and she came out of that parent-teacher conference, and I remember she was crying. She was very upset, and all she kept saying was that the nuns that she had gone to school with had been so kind to her. So it wasn't like they didn't recognize it. It was more like it was just hard to deal with. It was like, I don't know. We would be out somewhere, and my father, I could see him, that he was trying not to be violent. Because I think when he was younger, his default was to get into fistfights, and it got him in trouble. He grew up in a family of boys. He was rowdy, and so he would get into fistfights with people who insulted him or, called him pejoratives. And when I was a little kid, he had children, and he didn't want to get in trouble with the law again because he had already been in and out of the prison system in California as a minor. And so when we were out and about and people would say something to us, about us, I would see him that his body would be very tense, but he would force himself to walk away and drag us away, and then everyone would get in the car, and it would be very awkward and very silent and very difficult. It wasn't something that we unpacked intellectually,
Well, the stories, particularly around your parents, I have to say, I think this is one of the best books I've ever read that tells such intimate stories about somebody's parents. Mm-hmm. Did your mother read the book?
My mother, what's so funny is that when I was writing the book, my mother was not in it very much. So you say that she's very fleshed out and you really get to know her. It was not that way. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, she passed away, not from COVID. She had had a long bout with lung cancer, non-smokers lung cancer, and she died in January, which was a relief. It was really a gift because we could all be around her bed. We were in Arizona. She passed away. And then she would have been so frightened by the pandemic had she known it was coming. But when she died, I went into this very intense mourning that was probably affected also by the pandemic and the fear I felt for my children. And I was so distraught that at night I would just have to get into a hot bath and try to calm myself down because I was having like so much anxiety and I was so upset. And when I finally kind of settled and, kind of relaxed into the pandemic and we were at home and I went back to work on the book, and suddenly my mother started to emerge on the pages. It was like I started to want to understand her more than I had before. And there's a story about a funeral that James Joyce wrote where there's a man who's from kind of the back country of Ireland, is very traditional and still speaks in his odd brogue accent and knows all the old songs, and his wife aspires to be a city woman who is less connected to the countryside than him. And when she sees how moved he is by these old songs, it irritates her because it's not sophisticated enough. And I read that story around that time, and I remember thinking, I thought my father was the main character who outshone everyone in his humanity and his complexity and his trauma. And then suddenly I saw my mother like that woman, like someone who had given up so much of her history to fit in and was so aspired to be something that she could never fully be to anyone but herself. And then I knew her story was as important to the book as my father's was. And before that, I always thought the book was about my father, mainly. And then I suddenly realized I can't leave my mom off the page. Also, my mother saved my father's life because she never drank alcohol. She was a very straight she kept the family in check. She took us to our dental appointments and our orthodontist appointments and our soccer, our basketball games and Girl Scout troop and all the things that she did. And I don't know that I had ever given her credit for that before.
And it was really important, I understand, that your dad liked the book. Can you say some more about that?
My father is a very wise man, and so I feel like he's gentle and he's thoughtful. He's been like this most of my life. He went through a lot growing up, and I think it's just, we all depend on him. And so I was very concerned that I would get everything correct. And I interviewed my grandfather's sisters when I lived on the reservation in the late 90s. I mean, I worked on this book for a very long time. I didn't know it was a book yet, but it was my process for healing always involved kind of journaling and thinking about my life. And so I would recapture memories over and over and over until they were like scenes. And so people will say, how did you remember all the details? And I'm like, oh, I started writing when I was 19 and I've never thrown anything away. Then on top of that, I interviewed people, all the people in the family who remembered old things. But still, I kept looking to my father and hoping that he would confirm or that I could create consensus. I worried less about my sisters. And so I kept asking him if he would read the book, and he kept telling me, that he had faith in me and that, I needed to be as honest as I could, that he knew that I would be okay. And he had seen me publish little sections, but the book was all the way in galley form, and I was really getting nervous. And we were in Hawaii. My daughter was getting her PhD, and he came out. It was December. And there were stairs, and he's too old to take the stairs, so they had a way for the elders to get around. And so we split off from everyone else. They went up to save the seats, and my dad were walking. We were shoulder to shoulder. And I told him, Dad, the book is going to debut in February, and you still haven't read it. I'm starting to think maybe you're anxious or you're not happy. And he goes, no, I'm ready now, so send it to me. So I had a copy with me. I gave it to him. And when I got back to Santa Fe, he called me maybe 3 days later, and he said, I read the book. And I told him, what did you think? And he goes, you nailed us. That's what he said. You nailed us. You got it right. And I said, there have to be some things that I didn't get right. And he said, little things, but overall you captured the spirit of the family and the struggles that we've been through very well. And, we both cried. It was a really wonderful thing, because if I had been nominated for the National Book Award, if Time Magazine and The Atlantic both named it a top 10 book of the year, all genres included, like fiction, poetry, it was like all of these accolades, it would have meant nothing to me if I had become persona non grata in my father's home. It would have meant nothing.
What are some things that you have been really glad to take from your family experiences and that you hope continues to positively impact your children and generations forward?
Yeah, I think, how grateful I am that so many of my ancestors, they died in California. There was a high number of deaths during the gold rush, and it's such a miracle to have been born, in many ways, statistically, Native American. It's just, my culture has been a great, grand gift to me. I really feel that way. And I hope that my children know that it's okay for them. There are a lot of children now who are a quarter Indigenous, like my children are, or 1/3 Indigenous, and people, they look semi-white presenting, or they're ethnically ambiguous. And I'm like, the value system is so beautiful, like knowing that you have the earth for you there is sort of a profound spiritual belief system where you can kind of be there and go out. And all of our children love to hike and ski and swim in the ocean, and they're very tied in. And I think that's such solace in this world. I love being out in nature. For me, it's like a nature bath is what I need every day. And I hope that, for a long time in Native country, we've talked about this fear of appropriation. Like, people are appropriating our culture and they don't understand it. And seeing the direction that the world is going in, I challenge people a lot of times when they talk about that. And I say, wouldn't we rather have non-Indigenous people assimilated towards our value system, appreciative of our culture? In some ways, mimicry is a compliment. I know that a lot of times it's short-sighted and wrong-headed. It's complex, do you know what I mean? But a little more generosity in opening up our doors and sharing our myths and our belief systems, not only with our children who don't always look typically Native, but with even non-Native children, feels really important to me right now. And the one thing that I have to underscore most in like terms of what people take away from this book is just that it's hard to be an Indigenous child growing up in the United States or really anywhere around the world. And the last thing that they need, if Native people are listening, is to be rejected by their own communities because they don't look Native enough. That's heartbreaking to me, it's not good. And really, we don't want to drive them towards belief systems that are part of a destructive world. And so much in the world is destructive. And I would much rather have them come home and learn how to live gently and think about what they're using and what they're throwing away, and think about their value systems in a way that's, deeply connected to appreciating the planet, then I just feel like we should welcome them home with open arms, basically.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
I was very, very happy to be invited, and I've enjoyed spending time with you, Michelle.
So, Deborah, where can our listeners find you and your work?
You can find me at my website, www.deborahjtaffa.com. Or you can find me in my capacity as a director at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe at www.iaia.edu.
In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing, a national nonprofit mental health organization. You can learn more about Nexus and how to support our mission at nexusfamilyhealing.org. The show is produced by John Moe with music from Jeremy Messersmith. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate, and write a review. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray. See you next time.